There is a particular kind of writer who is most clearly seen from a distance, who is misunderstood, dismissed, or simply never quite claimed by the country that produced him, and who requires foreign eyes to be properly recognized. Ivan Turgenev was that writer. He was born on a vast Russian estate with 5,000 serfs. He died in France in the arms of the woman he had loved for 40 years, and in between he spent the better part of his adult life in self-chosen exile from a country that could not decide whether he was a traitor, a reactionary, a radical, or simply an artist, which, in the violent ideological climate of 19th-century Russia, was practically a dereliction of duty. Henry James called him a novelist's novelist. Gustave Flaubert was his closest friend. He was the man who introduced Russian literature to Europe, who made the European literary world understand that something extraordinary was happening on the eastern edge of the continent. And he was the creator of the ideological novel in Russia, the writer who learned to make political argument live inside human beings instead of being spoken through them. Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev is probably the most European of the great 19th-century Russian novelists. He was born 200 years ago on his mother's vast estate in Oryol, some 300 miles southwest of Moscow. His father was a handsome young cavalry officer who had arrived quite by chance at the estate, which appears to have been a self-contained kingdom with a private orchestra, and 5,000 serfs. This is his story. And the story of why he is more admired, still, outside Russia than inside it, and why that fact reveals something essential about what kind of artist he was. Turgenev's mother was apparently a tyrant who ran her estate with an iron fist, terrorizing her household serfs and her own children with equal impartiality. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable cruelty, a combination that Turgenev would spend his literary life trying to understand. The serfs on the Spasskoye estate were not abstractions to the young Ivan. They were the people he grew up among, whose dialects he absorbed, whose fates he watched with the helpless attention of a sensitive child who understood that something was deeply wrong but had no vocabulary yet for what that wrong was. The contrast between the cultivated surface of aristocratic life, the private orchestra, the European tutors, the French and German spoken at the dinner table, and the medieval brutality of the system that sustained it, this contrast was the first and most formative fact of Turgenev's inner life. It explains the particular quality of his prose, the lyrical, melancholy, elegiac quality that never quite lets you forget the suffering underneath the beauty. And it explains the earliest and perhaps most consequential act of his literary life, A Sportsman's Sketches. Turgenev's early short story collection, A Sportsman's Sketches, published in 1852, presented an affectionate, liberal-minded picture of the peasantry, helped educate the intelligentsia about the plight of Russian serfs, and is thought to have contributed to their eventual emancipation by Alexander II in 1861. Reading A Sportsman's Sketches strengthened Tsar Alexander II in his resolve to abolish serfdom, and so Turgenev's work indirectly helped pave the way for the Emancipation Act of 1861. The comparison to Uncle Tom's Cabin is not hyperbole. Both books worked by the same mechanism. They made the victims of an unjust system visible as full human beings. Not as political abstractions, not as objects of ideological argument, but as people with inner lives, with dignity, with the full range of human feeling that the system denied them. The imperial censors understood this perfectly. In 1852, while back in Russia, Turgenev was arrested and sentenced to 18 months of house confinement on his family estate after the publication of A Sportsman's Sketches, which was considered subversive to the status quo of Russian society. He had also written, that same year, an unauthorized obituary for Nikolai Gogol, the man he considered his great literary predecessor, which the Petersburg censors suppressed. The combined provocation was enough. He was exiled to his own estate, under police surveillance, for nearly 2 years. It was the Russian government's way of asking him politely to stop telling the truth. But before a sportsman's sketches, and before the imprisonment, there was a meeting that structured the rest of Turgenev's existence with a logic more powerful than any political commitment or literary ambition. In 1843, while out hunting on his 25th birthday, Turgenev met a middle-aged man, and a few days later was presented to his new acquaintance's wife. Pauline Viardot was a famous, and reportedly plain, Paris-born opera singer of Spanish descent. He fell in love. Viardot and her husband appeared to accept this devotion. Turgenev and Viardot may or may not have been lovers, but they shared an intense bond. The nature of the relationship between Ivan Turgenev and Pauline Viardot, whether it was platonic or romantic, remains a subject of debate among scholars to this day, constituting one of the most enigmatic chapters in the history of Russian literary life. What is not in dispute is the practical consequence. Turgenev learned Spanish to be closer to Viardot's cultural world. He resigned his post at the Ministry of the Interior. He arranged for his illegitimate daughter, born of a brief affair with one of his mother's serfs, to be raised by the Viardot family in Paris. He followed the Viardots across Europe, Berlin, Paris, Weimar, London, their chateau at Court Avenel, and finally Baden-Baden, where Pauline retired after her operatic career ended in the early 1860s. In 1863, Turgenev settled down in Baden-Baden, where he got to know German authors including Theodor Storm and Eduard Moreich. In 1871 he moved to Paris, where he met George Sand, Gustave Flaubert, Émile Zola, Prosper Mérimée, and Henry James. It was a faithful and unhappy love, and the word unhappy is important. Turgenev lived for 40 years in proximity to a woman who was married to someone else, who may or may not have been his lover, who was certainly the organizing principle of his emotional life and the reason he was never quite at home anywhere. This condition of permanent, insufficient attachment, present without belonging, soaked into everything he wrote. His characters almost invariably fail at love, miss their moments, arrive too late or leave too early, part forever in scenes of autumnal desolation that Turgenev rendered with a grace that literary history has never quite surpassed. Here we arrive at the central paradox of Turgenev's position in Russian literary life. Russian literary culture in the second half of the 19th century operated under a tyranny of commitment. The prevailing doctrine held that a writer's work must be identifiable with a position, that each novel was a statement, and the novelist's job was to make his statement as clearly as possible. Great critics like Vissarion Belinsky, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, and Nikolai Dobrolyubov applied this standard with a relentlessness that could only be called ideological. In the novels of Turgenev, this approach ran into a problem: he kept saying different things. A sportsman's sketches made him the hero of the liberal intelligentsia, the man who had struck a blow for the serfs. His novel On the Eve, with its Bulgarian revolutionary hero Insurov who seemed to embody everything the radicals wanted, a man of action, committed, clear-eyed, capable, confirmed his liberal credentials. This was the Turgenev of the liberals. And then, in 1862, came Fathers and Sons. Turgenev's novel was responsible for popularizing the use of the term nihilism, which became widely used after the novel was published. The nihilist in question was Bazarov, a young doctor of no aristocratic pretension, who rejected aesthetics, sentiment, tradition, and every value that was not measurable and useful. He dissected frogs. He believed in empirical science and the destruction of all existing social forms. He was brilliant, arrogant, genuinely impressive, and he fell in love. And the falling in love destroyed him, because it exposed the contradiction at the heart of his philosophy: a man who denies all sentiment, all irrational attachment, all the soft human things that his doctrine calls weakness, and who discovers that he cannot live without them. Although Turgenev claimed at one point that he meant the book to be a favorable depiction of the young radicals, this group viewed Bazarov as a spiteful caricature of them. Many of the older liberals did not understand the book and were also very upset at the influence it had on the young. The right wing thought Turgenev was attacking the radicals. The radicals thought he was making them look ridiculous. The liberals felt betrayed. The almost unanimously hostile reception given to fathers and sons prompted Turgenev to leave Russia. But Turgenev was perfectly consistent with himself. He had already, in his first novel Rudin, created a hero who was a young man of apparent genius, admired by everyone because he was young and eloquent and full of plans, who turned out to be Oblomov in action, or rather a mixture of Oblomov and Bakunin, the man of brilliant words who collapses at every moment of genuine decision. And in A Nest of Nobles, the radical students were already portrayed as decadent snobs. Turgenev had been saying, from the beginning, that the Russian radical intelligentsia was better at talking about revolution than at making it. Fathers and sons simply made that argument undeniable. The problem was that Russian critics expected novelists to be party members. Turgenev was an artist. The years at Baden-Baden produced the novel Smoke, set in that very town, infused with the bitterness of a man attacked from every direction. Smoke is infused with a satirically embittered tone that makes caricatures of both the left and the right wings of the intelligentsia. The love story is deeply moving, but both this emotion and the political sentiments are made to seem ultimately no more lasting and real than the smoke of the title. It is in Smoke that we find the image that concentrates all of Turgenev's poetry into a single passage, the student Litvinov watching the smoke of the locomotive dissolve into the sky like a small cloud, and everything seemed smoke to him, everything, his own life, Russian life, all human life, and above all Russia herself, smoke. It is the image of the man who has understood too much and can act too little, the man of unrealized hopes, unhappy as Turgenev himself was unhappy, the poet of failed aspirations in fathers and sons alike. The friendship with Flaubert deserves particular attention, because it explains something essential about Turgenev's artistic method. Both men shared a rigorous aesthetic conscience, the belief that the novel was a serious art form that required the same care, the same ruthless revision, the same patient attention to the precise word, that one would bring to sculpture or painting. Turgenev helped Flaubert champion his works abroad, even translating some of them. He also promoted Zola in Russia. Called by Henry James a novelist's novelist, Turgenev authored spare, carefully crafted works, Russian in subject matter but informed by attachments to Western political and social trends. This is the Turgenev that Russian critics found suspicious, too elegant, too concise, too much the craftsman. His novels are the shortest in the Russian tradition. They are built in the French manner, not vast panoramas but rapid dramas, concentrated scenes, characters under pressure who reveal themselves in action rather than in those great Russian rivers of internal monologue and philosophical digression that we associate with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Fathers and Sons, technically, is one of the great masterpieces of 19th-century fiction, not despite its compression but because of it. There is one area of Turgenev's fiction where even his most severe Russian critics fell silent, his women. They were drawn with the tenderness of Rococo, and this is not a dismissive observation. Turgenev's female characters consistently possess more resolution, more moral clarity, and more capacity for decisive action than his men. They are the ones who choose, who commit, who follow through, while the heroes of the intelligentsia endlessly deliberate, qualify, and ultimately fail to act. Elena in On the Eve, Natasha in Rudin, the women of A Nest of Nobles, Odintsova in Fathers and Sons, these are among the most fully realized feminine presences in 19th-century European fiction. On the whole, Turgenev's female characters are more noble and resolute than the males. The pattern points towards something in Turgenev's own psychology: the man who loved for 40 years without resolution, who was always orbiting the woman he loved, who had made his own life a prolonged exercise in the poetic inadequacy of a male will. He knew this inadequacy from the inside, and he rendered it with a compassion that made it art rather than self-pity. The other defining quality of Turgenev's prose, inseparable from the women and from the love stories, is the farewells, the scenes of departure, of leave-taking, of the moment when the student returns to the city and understands that the summer is over and this landscape, these fields, these people will never be quite like this again. Almost every Turgenev novel has such a scene. He returned to it obsessively, with the fidelity of a Marcel Proust evoking the indelible memories of youth. The great country estates of interior Russia, the hunting trips, the autumn light across the fields, the young women glimpsed in summer who will be different or gone when summer comes again, all of this Turgenev preserved with a grief that is both personal and historical, the grief of a class and a way of life that both he and his readers knew was ending. The paradox is this: the very qualities that made Turgenev suspect in Russia, his artistic detachment, his refusal to commit fully to any ideological position, his preference for meaning over statements, his psychological subtlety over programmatic clarity, were exactly the qualities that made him the ideal ambassador for Russian literature in Europe. Fathers and Sons is the first Russian work to gain prominence in the Western world, eventually gaining the approval of Gustave Flaubert, Guy de Maupassant, and Henry James, proving that Russian literature owes much to Ivan Turgenev. For European readers, Turgenev was not exotic. He was familiar, or rather, he was strange enough to fascinate but not so strange as to alienate. He had absorbed George Sand's combination of social concern and bucolic atmosphere, the moral seriousness of Charles Dickens without the vulgarity, the artistic conscience of Flaubert without the cold misanthropy. He wrote in a tradition European readers recognized, the compact, psychologically precise novel of the French school, while depicting a world they had never seen. He was an aristocrat Frenchified by temperament and by decades of Parisian life, who spent those same decades carrying Russia around inside him like a wound. Referring to the novels of Turgenev in his partial portraits, Henry James wrote, "They gave one the impression of life itself and not of an arrangement, a réchauffé of life." That phrase, the impression of life itself, is the highest compliment James ever paid a novelist. And it explains why Turgenev's influence extends so far beyond what is commonly recognized. Henry James learned from him the technique of the central consciousness, the careful positioning of narrative perspective inside a character who perceives the story rather than generating it. Proust learned from him the art of involuntary memory, the way that a landscape or a smell can suddenly crack open the past. Even Hemingway, via the Russian-influenced writers who influenced him, felt the distant pressure of Turgenev's economy, his refusal to say more than the scene required. Turgenev was limited, and this honesty is part of its greatness. Turgenev does not produce immortal characters in the way that Gogol, Goncharov, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky do. Bazarov is magnificent, but he does not quite achieve the permanent symbolic weight of Oblomov or Prince Mishkin or Anna Karenina. Turgenev's characters tend to dissolve into the poetic sky above the Russian estates, to become atmosphere rather than monument. They are people, fully rendered and deeply felt, but they are also suffused with a lyricism that softens their edges, that makes them inseparable from the landscape and the season in which they appear. This is both the limit and the achievement. Turgenev is not a philosopher. He does not have a philosophy in the systematic sense. He gives meaning rather than statements, and meaning is the province of the poet rather than the ideologist. What he knows cannot be reduced to a proposition. It can only be felt in the quality of a scene, the smoke from the locomotive dissolving in the sky, the student riding away from the estate for the last time, the woman standing at the window as the carriage disappears down the road. Henry James's phrase, "the still sad music of Turgenev," is perhaps the most precise description of his work ever written. It is a music, first of all, organized, formal, constructed with care, nothing accidental. And it is sad, not with the savage despair of Dostoevsky or the tragic grandeur of Tolstoy, but with the particular sadness of the man who sees clearly what has been lost, what will be lost, what can never be recovered, and who transforms that seeing into the most refined prose of his century. Ivan Turgenev died on September 3, 1883, in Bougival, near Paris, in the house he shared with the Virdot family. He had asked to be buried in Russia, in the Volkovo cemetery in St. Petersburg, beside his friend, the critic Belinsky. His coffin was accompanied by enormous crowds at every stop on the journey across Europe. In 1879, the University of Oxford had conferred upon him the degree of DCL, Doctor of Civil Law. He was, by that point, one of the most celebrated writers in the world. And he was more admired and better understood outside Russia than inside it. That gap, between Russian suspicion and European admiration, has never entirely closed. Russian literary culture, which demanded from its writers a commitment, a position, a clear answer to the great questions of Russian life, could never quite forgive a man who answered every question with a precisely observed human being instead of a political argument. European literary culture, which had learned to value exactly that kind of answer, received him as what he was, a master. The irony is that his work, the sketches that helped end serfdom, the novels that named nihilism and mapped the generational fractures of Russian society, had more political consequence than all the ideological novels that his critics preferred. He changed things by depicting them faithfully, not by telling his readers what to think. That is the Turgenev legacy. And it is, in the end, a lesson in what art can do that argument cannot. It creates the impression of life itself. And in that impression, quietly, everything is said. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story.